The scout ship died in 11 seconds. Reeves watched it on the tactical display, watched the Council enforcement vessel's weapons lock, watched the single concentrated burst cross the distance between them at the speed of something that had no interest in mercy, and watched Scout 7 come apart in a bloom of debris and venting atmosphere that lasted 3 seconds and then was gone, scattered into the permanent dark between stars like it had never been there at all. 4 people on Scout 7. He had read their files that morning, the way he read every file before every operation, because the files were the only thing that made the numbers real. Ensign Cara Delgado, 23, from what used to be called Denver before the quarantine collapsed the old administrative boundaries and everything became just the zone. Specialist Marcus Webb, 31, who had a daughter he had never met because she had been born during the quarantine on a colony that the Council's supply blockade had reduced to subsistence living, and communications in and out were monitored and mostly denied. Senior pilot Yusuf Akafer, 44, 20 years of flying in the zone, the best low-signature pilot in Reeves' fleet, the man who could thread a ship through an asteroid field in the dark and make it look like nothing. Lieutenant Priya Solis, 28, Hannah Solis' younger sister. Reeves had not told Hannah about the assignment until this morning. He had not wanted to. He had made the call anyway because Priya was the right person for the job, and making calls based on who was right for the job rather than who you wanted to protect was the only principle that had kept him functional through 31 years of this. He looked at the debris field where Scout 7 had been and said quietly, "Log it." His operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Torres, said, "Logged, Commander. Council vessel is filing an administrative confirmation. Standard containment enforcement language." "Of course it is." Reeves turned back to the main display. "How many does that make this month?" 7 scout contacts eliminated. 12 civilian vessels turned back at the boundary. 1 medical supply ship, the Mercy Run, out of Colony 11, fired on and disabled when they attempted to cross at the Kelvar waypoint. 8 crew members, 3 confirmed dead, 5 status unknown. Reeves said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. He had been saying nothing useful for 31 years, and the math had never changed, and the boundary had never moved, and the Council enforcement fleet had kept doing what it had always done with the particular confidence of a system that had been running unopposed for so long it had stopped considering whether opposition was possible. He looked at the display for a long moment. Then he said, "Lieutenant Hannah Solis." Hannah was at the weapons console, and she turned at her name with the professional attention she always gave, the expression that said she was present and ready, and not going to give him anything he didn't ask for, because she had been in this fleet for 9 years and she understood how this worked. And then something shifted very slightly in her face, something that did not reach her eyes but was there in the set of her jaw, and he understood that she had already known. That she had been watching the tactical display too, and she had read the files this morning the same way he had. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Yes, sir." 1 second of silence, then she turned back to her console. Reeves turned back to his. On the display, the Council enforcement vessel was moving away from the debris field with the unhurried certainty of something that had completed a routine task. 4 people, filed as administrative. The Council vessel did not even slow down. He said, "Status of all ships." Torres said, "All 47 vessels holding position at the inner boundary marker. Stealth profiles nominal. No Council detection. Engineering reports all systems optimal across the fleet. 12 stealth units. Confirmed in position, Commander. 8 months in transit. They've been waiting." Good. Reeves looked at the debris field one last time. Scout 7 was already dispersing, the pieces of it spreading on trajectories that would eventually carry them into the dark where nobody would ever find them. 4 people. Gone. Administrative. He said, "All ships. This is Commander Reeves aboard the Defiance. You know why we're here. You know what the last 31 years cost. You know what they took from us and what they filed it under when they were done. Today we come out. Today we cross the boundary. Today every species in this galaxy sees what they made when they spent 31 years making us. He paused. Battle stations. All ships prepare to cross on my mark. The Defiance's battle stations protocol was silent. No alarms, no red lights. Just the smooth, disciplined shift of a crew that had trained for this specific moment 400 times and was now doing it for real, each person moving to their station, with the compressed efficiency of people who had grown up inside a quarantine zone and had learned early that survival was a practice, not a condition. Reeves sat in his command chair and watched the boundary on the display. An invisible line. 31 years of invisible line, maintained by Council enforcement vessels, and the standing threat of what happened if you crossed it, what had happened to hundreds of human ships that had tried to cross it, what had happened to Scout 7 11 minutes ago. He said, "Mark, 47 ships crossed the boundary simultaneously." The alert reached Volketh 17 minutes after the first crossing was detected, which was 16 minutes and 40 seconds longer than it should have taken. And the reason for the delay was that the Council's boundary sensor network had been calibrated specifically for the signature profile of human vessels, a calibration that had been accurate and sufficient for 31 years and was now catastrophically obsolete, because the ships crossing the boundary did not match the profile on file. Volketh was in his command suite aboard the enforcement flagship Eternal Mandate when the alert came through. He was reviewing the administrative confirmations for the week's containment actions, which was a task he performed personally, because he had learned early in his career that the quality of administrative record-keeping was the truest indicator of operational discipline. The confirmation for Scout 7 was in the stack. He processed it with the same attention he gave everything, complete, thorough, impersonal, and moved to the next item. The alert interrupted him. He read it twice. 47 contacts, unknown vessel classification, crossing the boundary on a broad front, spread across 900,000 kilometers of the zone's eastern edge, not matching any profile in the human vessel database. He said, "Tactical officer." Commander Hess appeared on the comm screen immediately. Hess had been his tactical officer for 12 years and had the particular quality that Volketh valued above everything else in a subordinate, which was the ability to deliver bad information without softening it. "Sir, we have 47 unknown contacts that cross the boundary at Mark 773 through 841. They are not matching human vessel signatures on file." Classification. "Working on it, sir. The mass readings are significantly larger than anything in our human fleet database. Weapons signatures are..." A pause. "Sir, the weapons signatures are not in our database at all. We're looking at technology that wasn't there when we last updated our human capability assessment." "When was the last update?" Another pause, shorter, more uncomfortable. 4 years ago, sir." Volketh set down the administrative confirmation he had been holding. How significantly larger are the mass readings? The lead vessel, designated Contact Alpha, is reading at approximately 6 times the displacement of the largest vessel in our current human fleet assessment. If the readings are accurate. "Are they accurate?" "Yes, sir." Volketh looked at his display for a moment. He had been enforcing the quarantine for 31 years. In 31 years, human vessels had crossed the boundary 412 times. Every one of those crossings had followed the same pattern: small vessels, civilian or lightly armed scout class, operating on desperation or defiance or both, eliminated or turned back without meaningful engagement. The pattern had been so consistent for so long that the quarantine had become, in practical terms, a maintenance function rather than a military one. The pattern had just changed. He said, "General quarters, all enforcement vessels to intercept formation. I want the reserve fleet on standby." He paused. "And get me a visual on Contact Alpha." The visual came through 40 seconds later. Volketh looked at it. The Defiance was 430 meters long, built in a cavern system 3 kilometers below the surface of an asteroid that the Council's surveillance network had catalogued as uninhabited and checked on a rotation schedule that the humans had figured out and worked around. Its hull was the same matte composite that the Council's sensors had spent 31 years learning to detect at the boundary, which was why it had been built from a different composite entirely, one derived from materials that occurred naturally in the zone and had no detectable synthetic signature. It looked nothing like anything the Council expected a human ship to look like, because it had not been built to match expectations. It had been built to work. Volketh studied the visual. He was not a man who reacted visibly to things. 60 years of command had trained that out of him. But he was precise in his assessments. And his assessment now was that the ship on his screen was not the product of a civilization that had been surviving at subsistence level behind a containment boundary for 31 years. It was the product of a civilization that had been doing something else entirely while appearing to be doing that. He said, "Intercept formation, all weapons hot." The Council enforcement fleet moved with the precision of a system that had been doing this for 2 centuries. 90 ships, experienced crews, weapons and tactics refined over 60 years of Volketh's command and 200 years of the Council's enforcement history before that. They were, by any reasonable military assessment, more than sufficient for the contact. Reeves watched them come on the tactical display and said, "Here they are." Torres said, "90 contacts, Commander, full intercept formation, weapons hot." Of course. Reeves looked at the formation geometry. It was exactly the formation the intelligence analysis had predicted, based on 4 years of watching Council enforcement fleet exercises through passive sensors positioned just inside the boundary. The Council had not changed their primary intercept doctrine in 60 years. They had not needed to. All ships, maintain formation. Do not fire until my order. Hana Soli said, from the weapons console, "Range in 40 seconds, Commander." "I know." 30 seconds. The Council fleet filled the tactical display, 90 points of light moving in the precise geometry of a system that had done this enough times to make it automatic. On the other side of the display, 47 human ships held their formation, spread across 900,000 kilometers, each one in the position it had rehearsed, each crew at their stations with the compressed focus of people who understood what today was. 20 seconds. Reeves thought about 31 years, about the virus that had hit 3 colonies and killed 4 million people before the zone's own medical teams figured out a treatment without any help from outside the boundary, because help from outside, the boundary had not been offered. About the supply ships turned back. About the colony on Epsilon 7 that had eaten emergency rations for 3 years when the agricultural shipments stopped. About the children born in the zone who had never seen open space, who had grown up knowing that the boundary existed and that crossing it meant dying, who had built their understanding of the universe around the fact of the quarantine, the way you built your understanding of a room around the fact of its walls. About his son. 10 seconds. He said, "All ships, open fire." The first volley was not intended to destroy. Reeves had been precise about this in the operational briefing, precise in the way he was precise about everything, because precision was the only thing that worked and imprecision was what got people killed. The first volley targeted specific systems, the secondary harmonic junctions on the Council ship's port shield arrays, a vulnerability that the zone's engineering teams had identified from analysis of the destroyed human ships. The Council had left debris from over 31 years, debris that human salvage teams had quietly recovered and cataloged and studied, until they understood the Council's shield architecture better than the Council's own maintenance manuals. 19 years of studying wreckage. This was what it had been for. The Council fleet's port shields failed in the first 4 seconds. Not all of them. The targeting solution required individual ship precision, and 47 ships against 90 meant not every shot landed clean. But 61 of 90 Council vessels lost port shielding in those 4 seconds, and the tactical implications of that were immediate and severe, because the human fleet's formation had been designed specifically to exploit portside vulnerability. The engagement became real. Volketh's tactical officer said, in a voice that had been trained to stay level and was working hard at it, "Sir, They're hitting the secondary harmonic junctions. Port shields are failing on account. A pause. 61 ships, sir. Volketh said, how are they hitting the junctions? Those aren't externally targetable. They are, sir, if you know the exact frequency and the precise angle of, the tactical officer stopped. Sir, they've known about this vulnerability. They've known for a long time. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of the most precisely executed fleet action Volketh had ever witnessed from either side of it. Human ships moving through council formation, with a positional awareness that should not have been possible for a fleet that had spent 31 years inside a containment zone. Except that positional awareness was what you developed when you spent 19 years running simulations against an enemy formation you had studied down to the individual ship's maintenance schedules. Reeves lost ships. He had known he would lose ships. He had built that into every projection, had briefed his captains on acceptable loss parameters with the cold arithmetic of command, had understood from the beginning that bringing 47 ships against 90 meant some of those 47 were not coming home, and the only question was whether the losses were sustainable. They were not sustainable enough. The Council's tactical adaptation was faster than the models had projected. Volketh was a 60-year commander, and he was watching his fleet take damage from an angle his doctrine had never addressed, and his response was to compress the formation, pull the 90 ships into a tighter geometry that reduced the portside exposure and changed the engagement parameters. It cost him. The compression created other vulnerabilities, and the human fleet exploited 3 of them in the first 40 seconds after the move. But it also worked, and working imperfectly was better than not working at all, and the tighter formation started to find its rhythm against the human attack pattern. The Defiance took a direct hit at the 11-minute mark. A Council weapons burst that got through the forward shield on a frequency that Reeves' engineers had not anticipated, not because they hadn't tried to anticipate it, but because the Council's weapons officer had improvised in the middle of combat, which was the kind of thing that happened when you put a 60-year commander in a deteriorating situation, and he started making decisions that his doctrine didn't cover. The hit took out the Defiance's secondary propulsion array and killed 4 people in the engineering section and blew Torres sideways out of his seat hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Torres got back up. Reeves said, "Damage report." Torres said from the floor in the process of getting back to his station, "Secondary propulsion gone. Forward shield at 40%. Engineering section casualties, 4 confirmed, 2 more status unknown. Weapons nominal. Then we're fine." Reeves looked at the tactical display. 11 minutes. His fleet had destroyed or disabled 22 Council vessels and sustained losses of 6 ships. The math was not comfortable. The math was not going to get more comfortable. He said, "How long until the reserve fleet arrives?" Torres had made it back to his console. "Based on their last known position, 14 minutes, sir." 200 additional Council ships in 14 minutes. The original 90 now reduced to 68 operational. 41 human ships against 68, and then 200 more coming behind them. He said, "All ships formation Delta, we hold position." Hana Soli said from the weapons console, "Commander, I'm reading Scout 6's transponder." A pause. "It's on the debris field from the boundary, the one from this morning." Reeves said nothing. She said Priya was a good pilot. He said yes, she was. He looked at the tactical display. "Keep firing." The comm crackled. A voice, tight with static and the specific compression of a damaged transmitter fighting to maintain signal. Female. Young. "Defiance, this is Lieutenant Commander Hana Solis aboard the Kepler's run." A burst of static. "We've taken critical damage. Propulsion and life support failing." Another burst. "Tell them we were here, Commander. Tell them we came out." Reeves' hand was on the comm response trigger. He held it there. He looked at Hana at the weapons console. Hana was looking at the tactical display with both hands flat on her console and her jaw set in the precise way that it set when she was holding everything still. He pressed the trigger. He said, "Kepler's run, your record is in the log, we see you." Static, then nothing. He looked at Hana. She said without turning, "I'm still on weapons, Commander." He said, "I know." He turned back to his display. 41 ships, 68 council vessels, 200 more in 13 minutes. On every console on the bridge, the numbers were the same, and the direction they were moving was the same, and everyone on the bridge could read the trajectory as clearly as he could. He said, "Tors, 12 stealth units, confirm status." Tors said, "All 12 confirm ready, sir, waiting on your authorization." He looked at the display for one more second. Then he said, "All stealth units, authorization code Reeve 77 actual, you are authorized, broadcast everything." 12 ships, 8 months in transit through the deep dark of Council space, running completely silent on a trajectory that no Council patrol had ever covered, because Council patrols covered the boundary and the space adjacent to the boundary, not the deep interior routes that existed in the gaps between patrol schedules, gaps that the zone's intelligence analysts had spent 4 years mapping from passive sensor data. 12 ships that had left the zone 8 months ago had spent those 8 months threading through the gaps in the patrol network, moving at minimum power on minimum signature profiles, navigating by dead reckoning, and the kind of navigational patience that came from growing up in a place where patience was a survival requirement. Their targets were not military. They were not council vessels or weapons installations or fleet bases. They were the 17 primary relay nodes of the Council's grand broadcast network, the communications infrastructure that connected all 40 member species of the Council, and that every species in the accessible galaxy monitored as the authoritative source of Council announcements, administrative records, and official information. The kind of network that, if you put something on it, every screen in the galaxy would see it simultaneously. The kind of network that the Council had never meaningfully defended, because nothing had ever successfully reached it without going through the Council's outer security perimeter, which was a perimeter designed to stop an enemy approaching from outside Council space. The 12 stealth ships had been inside Council space for 8 months. Volketh was watching the engagement display, watching the reserve fleets approach Vector, running the arrival calculation for what was going to be a straightforward, if expensive, final engagement against a human fleet that had fought well and was now out of options, when every screen on the Eternal Mandate lit up simultaneously. Not a battle alert, not a systems warning, every screen. The command displays, the tactical consoles, the administrative terminals, the personal stations, the mess hall screens, the corridor information panels. Every screen on every Council vessel in the engagement zone, and as became clear in the subsequent seconds, every screen on every Council station and administrative post and inhabited world and civilian platform in 400 star systems, simultaneously, without warning. 31 years of classified documents. Council internal communications from year 3 of the quarantine, when the senior administrative board had reviewed the medical data on the virus and concluded that the biological threat had been contained and the quarantine was no longer medically necessary, and had filed that conclusion under restricted access and maintained the quarantine anyway. The asteroid mining survey data, showing 17 major extraction operations inside the quarantine boundary that had been running for 28 years, the resource value they had produced, the administrative framework that had kept them off the public record, the supply blockade orders, the instructions to Council enforcement vessels regarding civilian ships attempting to cross the boundary for medical or food supply reasons, the official language, containment enforcement action, administrative, protocol compliant, applied to 412 individual incidents over 31 years. And the colony ship documentation. The Meridian, civilian transport, 411 passengers and crew, attempting to cross the boundary at the Velkar waypoint in year 19 of the quarantine-carrying families relocating between zone colonies. Denied passage, attempting to cross anyway. Engagement authorization signed by the enforcement commander on duty. Signed by Volketh. Administrative confirmation. Containment enforcement action. Protocol compliant. 411 names. Listed. Broadcast on every screen in 400 star systems. On the Grand Council Station Meridian, 40 species sat in their designated seats and watched their screens go live with 31 years of classified administrative record and did not speak. The session that had been scheduled, a resource allocation hearing, routine, was not happening. Nobody in the room was looking at anything except the screens. In the 31st row of the observation gallery, a Draveki diplomatic aide who had been taking notes on the resource allocation hearing looked at the screen and looked at the name at the bottom of the colony's ship authorization, and looked at the screen again, and then looked at the Draveki senior delegate seated below and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say, because the document on the screen said everything. Volketh stood in the center of his command suite and looked at every screen showing the same thing and felt something that 60 years of command had not produced before, which was the specific sensation of a foundation giving way. Not the foundation of the engagement, not the tactical situation, not the military position. The foundation of the 31 years. The foundation of the administrative language and the protocol compliance and the containment enforcement, and the way that the math had always been simple, and the outcome had always been predictable, and the boundary had always held. The comm opened, direct channel ship to ship. He accepted it. The man on the screen was perhaps 50 years old, weathered in the specific way that people who had spent decades in space were weathered, with the quality of absolute stillness in his face that Volketh recognized, because he had spent 60 years cultivating the same thing in himself. The man was sitting in a command chair on a bridge that had taken visible damage, consoles dark on the left side, a structural brace jury-rigged across the overhead, the specific organized disorder of a ship that had been in hard combat and kept fighting. He said, Volketh. Volketh said, Commander Reeves. A pause. Reeves said, You destroyed 31 years of council authority in about 40 seconds. I want you to know we didn't do that lightly. We didn't do any of this lightly. Volketh said, You had 47 ships against 90. You took significant losses. You could not have won the military engagement. No, Reeves said. We couldn't have. He looked directly at the screen with the particular attention of someone who wanted the next thing to land cleanly. My son was on the Meridian. He was 9 years old. His mother had already made it to the outer colonies and he was traveling to join her, and the ship was denied passage, and then it crossed anyway and you signed the authorization. He said it without heat, without performance, in the level tone of someone who had lived with a fact for 31 years and had made his peace with carrying it, and was now simply stating it because it was true, and it needed to be said to the right person. I want you to know that I know that. I want you to know that I've known it for 22 years, and I want you to know that it is not why we did this. Volketh said nothing. Reeves said, We did this because 400,000 people are living inside a boundary that your own medical board confirmed was unnecessary 28 years ago, and the reason it stayed up had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the extraction surveys. And every species in this galaxy just read that in your own documents on your own broadcast network. We didn't come here to fight your fleet. We came here so that when the galaxy looked at the quarantine, they would look at it with accurate information. He paused. Check your broadcast network, Volketh. Check what's happening in your council session right now. And then tell me whether you think this engagement is the conversation worth having. Volketh looked at his screens. 40 species watching, every administrative record displayed, his name on the Meridian authorization, visible to every inhabited world the Council's broadcast network reached. The reserve fleet was still coming. 200 ships, 14 minutes out, now 11. He still had military dominance. He could still end this engagement as a military matter, could eliminate the 41 human ships currently in his engagement zone, and file it under containment enforcement and administrative protocol compliant and move forward. He looked at his own name on the screen. He said, "Stand down the reserve fleet." His tactical officer said, "Sir." "Stand them down." A pause, then, "Aye, sir." Reeves watched the reserve fleet contacts on his tactical display change heading, pulling back from their intercept vector, the 200 points of light redistributing into holding patterns outside the engagement zone. He watched for 12 seconds to confirm the heading change was real and sustained, and not a tactical repositioning. It was real. He said to Tors quietly, "All ships stand down from active engagement. Hold position." Tors said, "Aye, Commander." The engagement was over. On the Defiance's bridge, nobody moved for a moment. Hana Solis was still at her weapons console, both hands flat, the specific stillness she had been holding for the last hour. The tactical display showed 41 human ships in a spread formation, 68 council vessels in a compressed formation, and 200 reserve fleet ships pulling back in the middle distance. Between them, the debris of what the last hour had cost. Reeves said, "Hana." She turned. He said, "Stand down weapons." She looked at him for 1 second. Then she said, "Aye, Commander," and began the shutdown sequence. The quarantine boundary was behind them. Somewhere back along their entry vector, invisible in the dark, the line that had defined the shape of human space for 31 years. It had never been a physical thing. It had been a consensus, maintained by force, agreed to by 40 species who had been given a medical justification. They had not looked at too carefully, because looking too carefully at the justifications for convenient arrangements was not something that large, comfortable systems did unless someone made them. Someone had made them. The council session on Grand Station, Meridian, produced an emergency resolution within 6 hours. The quarantine was formally suspended pending review, which was the administrative language for over, because the review would confirm what every species-own analysts were already telling them from the documents on the broadcast network, and the review would produce a finding, and the finding would be that the medical justification had expired 28 years ago, and the continuation had not been medically grounded. Reeves received the notification on the Defiance's bridge 7 hours after the engagement ended. He read it. Then he set it down. Tors said, "Commander, the boundary is open." Reeves said, "I know. What do we do now?" Reeves thought about that for a moment. He thought about 31 years and what they had cost, and the names in the log, and the 4 people on Scout 7 this morning, and Hana Solis at the weapons console holding everything still. And he thought about the children born in the zone who had never seen open space from the outside of a boundary. He said, "We go home, we tell them it's open, and then we figure out what comes next." Tors said, "What does come next?" Reeves looked out the forward viewport at the stars, open, unobstructed, the same stars that had always been there on the other side of a line that was not there anymore. He said, "Everything." He was standing at the viewport when the young ensign from navigation, a 24-year-old named Dirk Voss who had been born in the zone and had never in his life been outside the boundary until this morning, came to stand beside him. Dirk had been quiet through the entire engagement, doing his job with the focused competence that Reeves had come to expect from him, and was quiet now, standing at the viewport looking at the stars with the expression of someone seeing something familiar for the first time. He pressed his hand against the transparasteel, fingers spread, touching the glass between himself and the open dark. He said after a long time, "Is it over, Commander?" Reeves thought about his son, about Hana's sister, about the Kepler's run and the Meridian and the 4 million who had died in the first years, and the 2 million more in the years after, and the 31 years of Scout 7, and administrative confirmations and containment enforcement and protocol compliant. All of it, the whole enormous weight of it. He said, "The quarantine is over." He looked at the stars. Everything else is just starting. Dirk kept his hand on the glass, looking out at the open space that had always been there, on the other side of a line that existed no longer, at the stars that did not know or care what had happened today, and shone with the same indifferent light they had always shone with, which was fine, because the stars did not need to know. The people did. 400,000 of them, back inside the zone that was not a zone anymore, going about their day in the specific way that people went about their days when they did not yet know that something fundamental had changed. They would know soon. The notification was already transmitting. Every colony, every station, every settlement built out of necessity and stubbornness, and the refusal to stop building even when the boundary said stop. They would know. Reeves stood at the viewport of a ship that had crossed a line that no human ship was supposed to cross, on a day that had cost what it had cost, looking at the open dark, and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Not yet, there was still too much to do, but the carrying was different now. The weight was different, the direction was different. He had come out. They had all come out. The stars were still there, bright and steady and indifferent and everywhere. And for the first time in 31 years, there was no line between humanity and them. That was enough. For now, that was enough.